Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Beyond Talking Points. Today, I'm the one who's leading us into the episode instead of Matt. If you're a regular listener, you'll know that Matt typically does the lead-ins, and that's because, unlike most episodes, we don't have a good jumping off point for this one. Typically, we'll come up with an article or a video we'll both watch, and it will really speak to us, and we'll have stuff to argue about. But this week we were like really hitting our heads against the walls. There's so many things out there that have been jumping out to us, but they're like really niche or really specific, or we're still undecided on how we feel or things are unfolding in real life. And I got this grand idea of throwing a lot of things at Matt, pretty much interrogating him a little bit on his philosophy or maybe why he sees the world in certain ways. Because I've had a lot of thoughts on, I guess it kind of starts from thinking about different branches of the right. Um, so when we talk on on this podcast, my views originated as a person who considered themselves a right wing libertarian, but now I'm a full blown Ancap that doesn't really see the point of voting. And Matt comes from the tradition of being somewhat of a anti-government Marxist in a way, but in practice in the United States, he's been a supporter of people like Bernie Sanders. Um, and I wanted to talk a little bit about things like neoconservatism, and then also talk about some paleocons, and to bring in other few groups in that spectrum, and feel out some potential places of agreement where Matt might see eye to eye with them in ways that he might not want to, where I think there might be some overlap, and I want to push back on him if he does or doesn't see things the way I think he should, because that's what I do on the show. Um, so I guess where I wanted to start a little bit was, well, we were talking a lot about the idea of war. So we watched a video on Woodrow Wilson, and both of us seem to be against a lot of what Woodrow Wilson did in real life with his foreign policy. Um, and in a way, he is kind of the originator of neoconservatism, even though he comes from, like, he was the original progressive. But he put us in a lot of entanglements, and in a way, he was a globalist of sorts, but at least in terms of foreign policy. I kind of want to take a step in the direction towards thinking about globalism as an idea, and the idea of a moral order that goes beyond the bounds of just a country. So these are two things that are kind of relevant to a lot of conversations that maybe like Tucker Carlson would have some views on that would be different than maybe a Ben Shapiro. So somebody who doesn't want to go to war versus somebody who thinks Israel is the shining beacon of democracy in the Middle East, needs to be protected at all costs, and potentially other places need to be overthrown. So I guess I want to feel out what your relationship is in your mind, I guess, with the prevailing morality in other nations, especially their government. Like, so obviously, it bothers me that China is a fascist regime that kills people. I'm a little bit of a China skeptic on certain things, as I've kind of hinted at. But I know the government's still terrible. It does evil things, censors people, and hurts people in the country. I'm not a fan of that, but I'm also not a person who thinks it's any country's job to really invade and overthrow the regime because of this. So, what are your thoughts on that kind of issue? And do you think it's more, I guess, nuanced than that? I guess this gets to the idea of when a regime is bad enough to be worth being overthrown from the outside, because I think that is one of the founding key elements of neoconservatism. So I think that's gonna be our jumping off point.
So, if anyone's seen the episode on World War II, whether the U.S. should get involved in World War II, I came out on the side of the U.S. should have gotten, or it did, of course, but it should have. It was the morally right thing for the U.S. to get involved in World War II. I think it is tricky because I don't think you can enforce you can't like enforce democracy, or you can't enforce your moral or your ideal system of government, or your moral code, so to speak. So I can't justify regime change in the Middle East or in the Latin or South America or anywhere really. At least I can't justify most of what the U.S. has done post World War II on the grounds that, well, I mean, on multiple grounds. I mean, one, I don't think the U.S. often has noble ends. I don't even necessarily think we are trying to spread democracy. But even if we are, even if we take the neocons at their even if we assume they have the best intentions, even if we assume that Dick Cheney and George W. Bush truly wanted to liberate Iraq from the brutality of the Saddam Hussein regime, and it wasn't for other reasons, that doesn't necessarily justify invading Iraq. It doesn't necessarily, because I don't think you can force people to do the right thing. I don't think you can force people to accept the right system if there is a right system. But that doesn't mean, I don't think that totally discredits military intervention, however. But I think it has to be, I think that's one of the, like a last resort kind of thing. Like you don't do it unless there's really no other option. I think like in the case of World War II, that there really was no other option.
Well, and I think another important element is the concept of, I guess, what is like a winnable war, or what is a winnable occupation. So, and one of the reasons why I think a neocon would push back on what we're saying is, to them, I think they often have this view that is so unadulteratedly pro United States and United States military that it makes every type of entanglement the US can get in seem not as challenging as it is in practice, right? So what you just said, kind of one of the subtexts of what you said is, it might be hard to enforce a country to be democratic, right? And if you investigate that point a little bit, what I think that gets at is the central planning apparatus of the war state that says, we want this place to end up being a democracy. It might not be as easy as it sounds. It sounds like, oh, if we overthrow their leader, the people will want this, and then it will happen. And that hasn't been the case in practice for 20 years. So I think one of the places where neocons really diverge is what is seen as a winnable confrontation. Now, the other issue is winnable means something different to kind of everybody, because certain people are willing to have much higher, I guess, body counts on their side. So somebody in good faith could say, like, maybe we shouldn't have gone into like whatever war, because even though we won it, it wasn't really a win to them because of how many people you lost. So it wasn't really worth it. But like hypothetically, most military endeavors the U.S. could be in is winnable. It's just at a very high cost in certain ways. So I think that's one of the elements where a lot of like neocon pundits, I do take at their face value, because even though I think a lot of them have things to say that are, I guess, disgusting, or I think their ends aren't even that good in practice, I think they are just doing a calculation that is based on something internally that is just very different than my calculation. So something could seem winnable. And the only thing I disagree on is kind of what you're saying. It's like, but it's not going to be as easy as it sounds. And they're just willing to have a lot more death and money put into it than I ever would be. So I think that is a crucial factor that plays into when it's good and when it's not.
Well, and I think neoconservatism is a fairly new ideology, and I think it really comes out of the fact that the U.S. kind of so when the British Empire collapsed, to put my historian hat on for a second, the U.S. kind of took its mantle. Now, obviously, the U.S. and the British Empire aren't equivalent in the sense that we're not technically an empire. We don't really conquer people or colonize other countries in the way that the previous colonial powers did. But we are the predominant force in the world, and we have the greatest amount of economic and military and political influence. We are called the only superpower in existence right now. And so I think I see neoconservatism really as a way of continuing that dominance. The U.S., we're assuming that the U.S. is morally superior to, or you know, I guess people of European descent more generally, are morally superior to other peoples, and therefore we need to impose all these values on other countries. And that's not to say, I mean, I take, being an American, being someone of European descent, obviously I take a lot of my ideas from the European intellectual tradition, and I think I still think my views are firmly planted in the ideals of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution and whatnot. But you know, it's like, so when in 1979, when Iran had its revolution and became an Islamic republic, I don't personally want to live in an Islamic republic because I think that's, I mean, at some level, I'd almost say it's a contradiction in terms, in the sense that I think republics should be secular. But even if I put definitions aside, I just don't think a government should have anything to do with religion. I'm firmly in the separation, in the camp that believes in separation between church and state. But again, can I say to everyone in Iran, I disagree with you, therefore I'm going to impose my will in that context? No, I can't. If someone wants to live in Islamic Republic, if someone wants to live under a different system of government, I can't tell them no, I don't think.
So this raises a question that I think is interesting. So when people think of imperialism and neoconservatism, a lot of stuff that comes to mind is very recent history, like everything that's gone on in the Middle East in the last 20 years. But the things you're just saying kind of bring up the idea also of just influence, right? So if we take war out of the picture and we think of things that are like soft power, or we think of things that are certain international orders, they aren't necessarily neutral, right? Like you have certain groups like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And what those countries do is they essentially give money to poor countries, but with strings attached. It's, here's this money, but you got to do the thing that we want you to do because we're the ones donating most of the money to the World Bank. These are all imperializing institutions. But people, especially on like I guess the neoliberal left, champion this stuff. It's all viewed as humanitarian. And to some degree, I mean, you can't really push back too hard in the idea of like, well, they are giving money to nations that are very poor. So what is the matter with that? But you're still, I guess, telling them what they need to be doing. So what kind of intuitions does that bring out of you?
Could you rephrase the question? I didn't quite understand what you were asking.
Well, so we kind of talked about hard power and how it's generally not okay for a plethora of reasons. And it's really easy, I guess, I think, if you're a person who shares the intuitions that aren't like overtly militantly nationalist, it's easy to come out against war. It's pretty easy to. It seems like the only people in favor of it are people who have like intellectualized it to a weird level where they feel like it is super necessary, or it's the people who are just militant. But then if you're there are people who on the left who use the language of imperialism's bad, and that doesn't just mean war imperialism. It means influence peddling. It means, hey, here's some money and you have to do what we want. It means, hey, if you want us to provide for your defense, then you got to do this stuff to curry our favor. So we're still kind of blackmailing people into doing what we want. And they do really need the money. They don't take the money, there's death tolls. And so they kind of have to do what we want to some degree. This is what a lot of our multinational institutions are. Does that bother you at all? Or do you have any thoughts on that? Or is that just completely separate and that kind of imperialism should be, I guess, the overwhelming one, and it should be thought of positively?
No, I think I think I actually learned, or I was talking to someone not too long ago, and they were talking to me about how the Peace Corps is imperialist, and I never heard this before, so I was like, "Wait, what are you talking about?" And then I started, we were talking more, and And so I think it's actually fair to say that is influence peddling, as you call it, is something we should be suspicious of, because I mean, going back to the war example, I mean, people said I was using the Iraq War earlier. I mean, people said the Iraq War was a humanitarian war. People were justifying it on the grounds of Saddam Hussein's an evil man, an evil monster, and we have to save the people of Iraq from this evil monster. Now, of course, what people didn't take into account when they say that is the CIA had ties with Saddam Hussein. The British and American government had ties with Saddam Hussein. We were a supporter of Saddam Hussein. We helped him come to power. And then when he no longer suited our own interests, then okay, we could get rid of him. He didn't matter anymore. I'm against imperialism, whether it's soft or hard.
Well, so
or whether more like obvious or more subtle.
Yeah.
I mean, even the idea of like kind of forcing. So I was watching a documentary. I took a class in cultural anthropology, and we were watching a documentary about how all these nonprofits that are like, you know, encouraging people to donate old clothing, for example, at the end of the day, they actually hurt the economies of many of these countries that are getting these large swaths of old clothing. So it's not as simple as donating just this charity and you know, therefore improving the world. Actually, you could be harming the world by doing that.
Well, and that's so. Well, one of the things that happens is like, well, let's say the World Bank offers, you know, Haiti $500 million if they outlaw child labor. Well, one of the first things that I was kind of taught of an example about unintended consequences was an international institution, like pretty much mandating that a certain country stops having child labor, or else that country would be sanctioned. And then when they outlawed child labor, those parents couldn't. The reason the kids were going to work is because the family needed the money. So what really ended up happening was, instead of the kids making rugs for whatever tiny amount of money they were making, they were either not. They didn't end up going to school. They were either doing nothing, and their family had less money, or they were being sex trafficked. And if there's one thing we don't want, it's more kids getting sex trafficked. But that was an outcome of banning child labor. And it's not because child labor is a beautiful thing. It's because things that are bad, like child labor, happen for a reason. It's not an arbitrary like event in which child labor happens organic. It happens organically because there are incentives at place that mean, oh, the only way this family can survive in the slums or if this happens. So it like makes sense in a way, even though it's really messed up. And all of us go, ew, child labor, that's bad. But it's like, well, if they don't have it and you outlaw it, what do those kids do? Because that family cannot provide at all. So things like that happen in a lot of international institutions. And this kind of just goes to, I guess, my general critique of a lot of government or public policy that tries to get rid of things that are unfavorable. It either just kind of shoves it underneath things, or it makes something else replace it. But I think that's relevant here. But I guess the reason why I brought up soft power in the first place is to kind of bring up the broader question of imperialism, which you addressed. But it's to ask the question of what counts as imperialism, and is it ever valid? That's a tricky question to navigate, because I don't think a lot of imperialism is necessarily bad. So like cultural imperialism, I don't think it's really a bad thing, because if people want to be interested in American culture because they think it's interesting, then they can. And like one thing that happens in North Korea, I'm under the impression that a lot of South Koreans smuggle all sorts of media into North Korea, or they there are certain places in North Korea that are like we're at some points vulnerable to having things smuggled in, and that's people brought media into those countries. So that's not a bad thing, but it's us trying to export our cultural values to show like, hey, here's a better world going on. The issue is when we start giving out money with strings, or we start threatening countries, like if you think of sanctions or tariffs, things like that, we end up trying to force countries to act in a certain way. So like China has a lot of factories where people are paid very little money. And we go, hey, that's bad. So we're going to say that's unfair. Now that we've labeled that as unfair practice and everybody in our country thinks it's gross for somebody to work in a sweatshop, we have now justified all sorts of like tariffs or sanctions. The issue is tariffs and sanctions hurt the poor people in a nation. So we're trying to export our ethos of a certain level of work, right? So in a way, this is imperialism. And we're enforcing it with tariffs and sanctions, which actually end up hurting those people worse. So I think in this effort of doing these nonviolent forms of imperialism, we just essentially plan poorly, and we end up hurting the poorest people. Like I think a lot of the sanctions on North Korea are because North Korea is an evil dictatorship, but I actually think those sanctions have a disproportionate effect on the people of North Korea. And anybody who talks about politics should be a fan of the people of North Korea. They should just, they should see all those people as essentially Jews in the Holocaust. They're kind of the same boat. But the people in charge of North Korea are the real enemy, and the sanctions don't really hurt those people in charge. So I don't know. I'm just trying to explore the validity of certain forms of soft power, I guess. That's just what I'm kind of trying to meditate on.
Well, I mean, so many. I don't want to go down a rabbit hole. I mean, I was going to add quickly. Unfortunately, a lot of in terms of say the Middle East, or like any examples of child labor or slavery or just other bad things that we think are bad, or I would say are bad, that they are the result of that imperialism, that interventionism, that they're and whether the imperialism or interventionism again was meant for to help the people in that were being invaded, or just to help the invaders, that there's been so many, as you say, catastrophic side effects. So it's not. And I mean, and the funny thing, like ISIS, for example, and this is kind of a side point, but I think it's important to acknowledge. I mean, ISIS is a direct consequence of U.S. foreign policy, and I mean, so you can say that there isn't. You can say that conservative Islam is a reactionary force that does a lot of bad things, but ISIS itself did not directly just come from Islam organically. It came out of Islam, but it spawned from external pressures, the pressures of Western countries and their various military escapades. Now, I think what I think the issue gets a little trickier when you talk about when you talk about human rights, and so I'm gonna say something, and you might think I sound like Woodrow Wilson here, which is fine. I do think there is I do think there's something about like a universal ethic that can be applied worldwide, that we can try to like we can try to follow to the best of our abilities. So like genocide, I would say genocide is immoral no matter what. And so I think genocides are. I think it can be morally permissible to try to stop genocides from happening, or to try to stop genocides in progress. It's actually ironic. So like when the Noam Chomsky, who's considered one of the most prominent anti-imperialists of our time, he was upset with he was upset with Trump because he thought Trump was abandoning the Kurds. Again, that's an arch anti-imperialist if there ever was one. I don't think you could ever really accuse Chomsky of being it being a neoconservative. But that he was not but that comment shows he was not against interventionism in all forms, which kind of goes back to something you were talking about before we started recording about pragmatism in politics. I'm not sure there are exactly hard and fast rules, but I mean, like another example, just to riff on this a little longer before you respond. We've never done an episode on the American Civil War. And that's, of course, a little different because, again, it's a civil war. It's a war within one country. But, of course, the South tried to secede when Abraham Lincoln was elected president. And, of course, you know, everyone on the internet goes crazy about what was it about? Was it about states' rights? Was it about slavery? But I mean, there's no question it was slavery was a huge part of it. It was, in fact, about slavery, by the way, but I don't want to get into that debate. I only bring that up because I think it was justified for Abraham Lincoln to put his foot down, to declare, I guess, martial law, so to speak, and to fight the South and to end slavery. Now, you know, you can bring up the fact that Abraham Lincoln, by our standards, was racist. You can bring up the fact that he didn't originally want to end slavery. But he did end up ending slavery, and to do that, he had to enforce. He had to put down the rebellion, or put down the revolt, re-establish federal control of the southern states, and then he said, "All right, we're going to end slavery. You know, it doesn't matter what you think. That I've decided this is the right moral action, and I'm going to stick with it." I think that was morally justified. You could argue that's imperialism, perhaps, but if it is, that's definitely justified.
Yeah, I'm not going to go too much in on that example, because if we were going to do an episode on that, it'd be an episode, and I'd want to make sure I felt comfortable completely with what I'd argue. And that's definitely something that you don't want to make misstatements on if you're going to post on the internet indefinitely. So it's a touchy subject. So I'm not gonna pontificate there. But I will say, I think that is an example of where a lot of the stuff we've talked about comes into play when you're talking about what counts as a humanitarian crisis that is important enough to intervene on. And this is like accepting, I guess, your adjudication of the events, and then it's like the to the degree it is winnable, and what the costs are of the conflict. So, well, one of the things that bugs me so much about policy, it's something I can talk about in policy in general, and I think it's relevant here, and I don't think I mind me bringing it up, is and I feel comfortable sharing this, but you've had my ire a few times, especially on this show. It's not because because we happily argue the philosophical grounding of a lot of ideas. But I feel like if I was able to, I guess, argue things in a grounded, narrow way, I might not even talk about the philosophy of it at all. Like, I feel like in practice, a lot of my views hold up better than they're given credit for by like the conventional media. So I can't have this conversation about foreign policy without kind of talking about some of the clear humanitarian crises that have been unnecessary, that are in the name of soft power or soft influence. Like you mentioned Chomsky getting really upset about abandoning the Kurds. It's really hard to, one thing that I'm going to briefly reflect on, I get to make a historical point, is World War I, and how World War I, at least the conventional narrative I was taught in school, I liked framing it that way because I could be wrong, but the conventional narrative that you're taught in school is all this happens because the Archduke is assassinated, right? And then due to intertangling alliances, all of these things fall into place, and then all of a sudden you have World War I. And it's really just a series of events as a result of a lot of commitments that were made to other countries. So it's like, okay, well, this person got attacked, which means these 4 countries go to war with this person, but that person had, 3 people backing them up, so they have to go to war with them. Well, now that this one on the other team, if they're getting attacked, well, that means that these 3 people got to jump in. Now this person's going to jump in. Okay, now everybody's in the war. Boom. Well, it's kind of hard to not like look at our current sphere and realize how many obligations are similar to this in the United States. And luckily, it's not as relevant in the day-to-day basis, but this is why you'll hear a lot of people freak out about what Russia's doing. This is why Rachel Maddow will be like, hey, are you paying attention to Ukraine today? Because you should, because, you know, if we actually take these alliances seriously, we might be in World War III tomorrow. And I don't really, I'm not one of those people that thinks we're going to have World War III in the next, you know, couple of years. But that's why there are people who are freaking out about World War III all the time. It's because of all these intertangling alliances. The other thing, and this goes to more of things in practice, but because of how, I guess, all over the place the United States is, we micromanage certain relationships. So the reason why there's, you know, a humanitarian crisis in Yemen is because we have certain sanctions that help keep the Yemeni people impoverished that are really there to like appease Iran, if I have this correct. And it is because of a certain relationship we would like to have presented to Iran. It's not even that I think it's that important to Iran. I think it's more of like, it looks like we're lowering our support for them if we stop doing this. And we don't want that perception. So we have to keep starving people who are just in Yemen, haven't done anything wrong. And those people are dying all the time and are starving to death. And it's really bad. And it's like, why? Because we care about optics of like a ton of relationships that shouldn't really matter that much. But, you know, you gotta do it. You gotta have embargoes. You gotta have this overwhelming influence. This is also why like the US does weird things to appease China, and it does weird things to appease other countries. It does weird things to like make sure Japan feels okay. All those things have costs. And those aren't often acknowledged because they're so distant from us. And a lot of them affect other people who are much poorer than us. And I don't think this is something that is reckoned with because it's not electorally important. And maybe this is something, maybe this is a critique of democracy too, to some degree. Because if these issues aren't electorally important, you know, nobody's number one issue really is Yemen, then there is no incentive for the leaders in the US to do something that looks bad against Iran that might actually like matter. But all these people are dying in Yemen. So it's like nobody's calling their congressman about it though. It's not something that's we're seeing in our face every day. So I guess this is me complaining more about soft power and central planning, I guess. But in practice, like this stuff really hurts people and it's like really messed up. And I find it very upsetting. And it's not just war in the traditional sense. Yeah, sorry, I'm just ranting. So any thoughts bouncing off that, feel free.
So a couple things. One, on the kind of World War One point, I do think World War One is a different kettle of fish than World War Two, mostly because the U.S. was only very indirectly related to that war, or it got tangled up into it, but into that war. But it got tangled up at the very end in 1917, kind of as a you know, we weren't in the main parts of that conflict. Now, of course. And then the video, of course, you sent me kind of framed it as all these progressives were totally war hawks, and that's why we have this terrible foreign policy nowadays. You can blame all the progressives, but of course it's funny because Tom Woods in that video acknowledges that you know, a good a very honorable man, you know, Eugene Debs was who was a socialist, mind you, was put in jail by Woodrow Wilson. So there were many honorable people on the left at the time, who progressives or socialists, who spoke out against the negative the negative impact that Woodrow Wilson's idea that you know, the U.S. could kind of control the whole world and in such a way that would benefit everyone, you know, be a benevolent gods, so to speak. So I just wanted to, we didn't really talk about that, but that was something that I had in mind. Then the other thing, of course, I think a difference between say now and say the 1960s and 70s, when like there was a very active anti-war movement. well, there's kind of a lot of things going on, but the current political climate is just so different. Unfortunately, it's very easy for people to tune out and not really care about, you know, Yemen or Syria or Iran, you know. Whereas with the Vietnam War, for example, it was far more in your face. It was far more. It was you kind of course, that some of it had to do with like you know, journalists uncovering up information that had been hidden from the public, and there was a certain level of disillusionment at the time with the government, which might have made people more keenly aware. And there was also just less information. There was less with the internet, with cable television. There's so much back and forth going on.
It was also the draft.
It was also the draft, yes. But I do want to add, though, because you obviously took your habitual jab at democracy. Most people, you're not going to like the way I frame this, but if you look at the polls, most people do not want, or most Americans do not believe in American interventionism. Most Americans do not want us in all of these foreign wars. They do not want us controlling, you know, trying to control all these various countries behind the scenes. They want us to focus on domestic policy. They want us to focus on improving the lives of people in this country. So I don't think we can write off people as, you know, just idiots who are willing to go along with the neocon foreign policy, because I don't think most people are idiots who want to go along with neocon foreign policy.
I think
they might be less active, again, compared to the anti-war activists during the Vietnam War, but that doesn't mean their opinion. That doesn't mean the average American wants is a neoconservative or believes in American imperialism.
And I wasn't critiquing neoconservatism in that last rant I went on. I was more of, and I think this is why I was saying it was a weakness specifically of like democracy, is because a lot of the Yemen stuff isn't the overt. It's not the overt war. It's not like 9/11 happened and we invaded somewhere. It's like we have an embargo and we sanction people and we say you can't trade with these people, or we can't give these people, or we're not allowing people to give certain people support. And these are not things that we associate with war. So it doesn't even get characterized in the same respect. And it doesn't involve, I guess, the amount of troops or the types of troops in the ways that people would associate with war. So like, I mean, at least with Vietnam, people are getting drafted to do it. So people had it in their face in their life and they got mad about it. They're like, why am I getting drafted to do this stupid thing? But people aren't even getting really upset in any mainstream way about like embargoes and sanctions, because in a way, an embargo and a sanction is really similar to a tariff. And people are really all for tariffs if they think it's good for Americans, right? If it's for Americans in a superficial way, and by superficial, I mean in terms of jobs, not in terms of prices or goods or consumers, but if it's good for the worker, then tariffs are seen as a good thing, and embargoes and sanctions can be kind of wrapped into that. Because if you're talking about sanctions on China, you can conflate sanctions on China with tariffs on China, because it's trade penalties with them because of something we don't like, and that might be related to labor even. So for that reason, people don't react the same way, even though that same type of power is used for things like start humanitarian crises. But the other thing I was going to add on too is you mentioned how people are anti-war. And I agree with that. That's like one of the big strong messages. And it's something that is maybe potentially attributable somewhat to Trump's rhetoric a little bit. If he did anything that I would be willing to give credit to, that's like one of the three things. But with that said, you simultaneously have people who are more like anti-China. Like now it's like almost a bipartisan thing. It's one of the most agreed upon issues in general. And it's not that people want American boots in China tomorrow, but you do have like this new Cold War ethos against China. So a lot of stuff on this soft power spectrum are kind of being pushed to the surface because we know that it's not really effective to have boots on the ground anymore. And I think to some degree, that's almost more alarming because the government doesn't have the baggage that comes with drafting people to Vietnam. So maybe that's the distinction I was trying to draw out.
Well, I see that as a problem. Well, maybe I'm not understanding the way you're framing it, but I see that as a problem of, or I see that as I see the government and the media as responsible for that. Again, I'm not blaming I'm not blaming Joe the plumber down the street, if he ends up spouting something he saw on CNN. I'm blaming CNN. I'm blaming Dick Cheney. I'm blaming Hillary Clinton. I'm blaming the people in power, and then the media figures who are perpetuating the talking points of these people in power. Because again, as I said earlier, it goes back to American exceptionalism. It's a last gasp. These ideas and this foreign policy is a last gasp of people who are trying to desperately hang on to the American century, which I'm not saying America is going to collapse tomorrow. It's certainly not going to. But all great powers, no great power lasts forever. And I don't think American dominance is going to last forever. But people in power want it to, and they've either convinced themselves that it's going to. So they're either willfully ignorant or they're delusional. They actually think that no, America is somehow inherently superior to every other country and is going to last, for eternity. But people used to say the sun never sets on the British Empire. And then in the span of a decade or so, the empire basically collapsed entirely, and is a shell of its former self. So I'm hammering home the that I don't think we can criticize the average person for that.
Yeah, I wasn't trying to criticize the average person. I was criticizing democracy, which in my mind is criticizing the same people you're criticizing. But that's where we disagree. But I don't want to get bogged down in that. There was a couple tangentially related issues I want to hit. One you just reminded me of, but I immediately forgot what it was. So I'm going to segue into the other one. This is something I ran by you before. I ran by right before we started recording. I'm not going to read it word for word, but it's that bit from John Dewey, kind of about war as a nationalizing force. And I wanted to tie this in with a couple of things that I guess are more currently relevant. But pretty much John Dewey essentially said at some point that he's kind of okay with war because it gets everybody on the same team. And then, if you nationalize enough, if you get enough people together nationally in the war movement, you can actually crowd out the private sector and boom, you don't have private stuff anymore. It's all the government. It's all of us working together for the country's interests. And that's what he wants in the end. So in a way, it's a socializing force. Well, a couple things. I guess the 2 points I'd hit on. One is the idea that World War II got us out of the Great Depression. That's like a common narrative. I'm not very sympathetic to it. I think it got a bunch of people jobs, but when a bunch of people's jobs are based around producing things that are then used and did not benefit anybody's well-being, right? So you made a bunch of guns and ammo, but guns and ammo don't really improve people's welfare. And I think a good economy is one that improves people's welfare. So I don't think it actually did anything on that front. But the common narrative is World War II got us out of the Great Depression, and it was a force that unified America. There was also the idea when COVID started, which was immediately politicized, I think for good reason. I'm glad COVID was politicized, but people are like, dang it, COVID could have been the thing that brought Americans together and we could have come together as a nation and healed, and we could have used it as a moment to all work together against something, and then we could have all been for the better. And then there's also this just kind of idea pushed around that America should unify over something that's kind of abstract, like maybe space travel. And then, if you can all unite around it and you can all work together, you can have this nationalizing unified force. I guess what I'm saying is a lot of my views on politics, I don't think it's because they're cynical, but I think politics is inherently polarizing. So whenever I hear these types of arguments, I think they're laughable. I don't think that's possible. I don't think it's not even that I don't think it happened. I just don't think that's even on the table. Because I think when you have this ring of power, there are always enough people who dissent that you have to be in opposition to. There aren't forces with universal praise, especially if there are ideas that seem universally praised, in practice, they don't usually work. And then half the people realize they don't like it once it doesn't work. And then you're polarized again. But I guess you're less, anti-unity in a way. I guess I'm essentially coming out as anti-unity because I don't really think it exists. And I guess what I'm saying is when people use this type of language and rhetoric, how does it make you feel? I know you I know you had a video on YouTube a while back, like during the 2020 election cycle, about the Unity 2020 thing that Brett Weinstein kind of pushed it. I know you had thoughts on that back then. I just it doesn't strike me the way it strikes other people. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on that, because I don't think I've ever really heard you out. I think it's loosely related to war in a way.
Yeah, I'm not actually sure I would go along with what I said in that video, because I think I was less critical of it in that video than I've come to be. I mean, am I pro unity? I mean, well, first, okay, I'll answer that question through the John Dewey quote. I do not agree with that quote. It's a stupid quote, or it's a stupid argument. John Dewey was a brilliant philosopher, but no brilliant philosopher is ever right on everything. I don't believe war. I don't believe in war as a unifying force, and I don't believe that's a good reason to go to war. And I'm not going to say we should go to war because it's going to get us universal health care. I mean, I don't see. I mean, I guess I'd have to look more into that historical context of Dewey's arguments. But I don't advocate for war on those grounds. Again, I advocate for war. If I were to ever advocate for war, it's only on the grounds of, it's only on certain pragmatic grounds of, we're in danger, or we're being invaded, or it's just a necessary moral action to take in this particular case. I mean, if I'm for unity, it's only in the sense that I see myself as, or I see every individual as part of a community, and I don't see a way of maybe this is just my own idiosyncratic personality, but I don't see a way of separating myself from my community, even if I am a hermit that spends all my time in his room. So I mean, politics is, I told you that whole Christopher Hitchens quote, which we had a disagreement on, about politics being divisive by definition. And you seem to, I think you interpreted that quote as Hitchens saying, oh, well, the government is deliberately dividing everyone and deliberately trying to stir up trouble, was kind of the way I heard you interpret it. But what he meant was, no, it's just politics is you're always going to have people who disagree with you on this or that issue, because these are, politics is about the matters that are very personal, that are very that you can have different opinions on. They're not very clear cut. They're not very black and white always, or it's not always easy to have one answer that everyone agrees with. And that's kind of what he meant by that. So I'm not here to be that, white liberal stereotype that says we should all just come together. I'm here to I do this podcast, for example, because I want to kind of explore what I think is what I want to explore, my worldview, explore other people's worldviews, see where we agree, where we disagree, and just kind of overall talk about or do whatever it is I can to make my case for what I think is how I think the world should be. But actually, if I may say something else really quickly, the Dewey quote made me think of, so I brought up Chomsky earlier. Chomsky's just a great reference point, because he says, he's written over 100 books. He says, gives so many lectures, whether you agree with him or disagree with him, he always has some interesting take to say. And he actually, he was a big anti-Vietnam War activist, and he talked about how intellectuals, helped get us into that war and helped prolong that war for longer than it should have been prolonged. So, with people like John Dewey or people like Woodrow Wilson, although Woodrow Wilson was kind of a pseudo-intellectual, or at least an intellectual of a third-rate intellectual. He was not a very good intellectual if he was an intellectual. But I think it's very we can see or I can see the argument that intellectuals have a tendency to go after or to fight for the goals that maybe a more sinister power structure is fighting for various reasons. And we can call out those intellectuals and say, hey, you know, you're just justifying, you're just rationalizing post hoc this, you know, atrocious foreign policy. It's not even a morally good foreign policy. It's not necessarily even going to work in the real world, but you're just justifying it because, you know, for some reason you have this ideology that, or you live in like you know, you're kind of an armchair philosopher and you think you can tell people what to do, how to behave, how the world should work. So there's definitely a room for criticizing intellectuals and for questioning what public intellectuals have to say. And I would call that rule. I would summon that rule when I'm talking about someone like John Dewey.
Well, and I do think when you start bringing up the role of intellectuals, especially when you start talking about like certain ways they philosophize things that are very real, it makes me want to bring up something that I know I've ran by you before and you didn't love it, and that was the idea of the constrained vision versus the unconstrained vision. And I think this is the most fun context to bring it up in because, as you and I both know, the people who tend to, and this is a Thomas Sowell kind of way of viewing things, but because Thomas Sowell is the one who likes to suggest that we look at things through these two boxes, he's really just trying to lay out things as we have ideals and we have tools at the disposal. If you accept that government exists, then they have certain tools, right? And there are certain things that we can fix, but even if we identify problems, we still have to recognize that not everything is a nail, that like not everything is a nail, not every tool is a hammer, and not everything is going to actually work in that simple of a way. So I think the big takeaway, if you think about Thomas Sowell's idea of the constrained and unconstrained vision, is there are certain things that by fixing them, you're actually not going to fix them because you're going to bring up other problems. Now, I bring this up because the irony is Thomas Sowell and the people he's often talking to are neocons, and I would say that they need to reevaluate their foreign policy views through the idea of the constrained and unconstrained vision, because I think that's why a lot of their views fall apart. But if you intellectualize things, it's very easy to observe certain things as problems in the view of like, in principle, X, Y, and Z is a problem. And this is why I mean, I hate to bring up things that are broad and we've argued about a lot, but this is why I guess I critique socialism a lot, is because there are things that are clearly problems. And I always talk to socialists and they always kind of, at first, when they realize I'm not a socialist, think I don't have a problem with stuff like poverty. I just don't think a lot of the tools that socialism offers actually fix the things it proposes. And that seems to me to be the grand failure of neoconservatism. Like if the things were as easy as neoconservative makes it out to be, then it would be simple. We'd just go in there and we'd just institute democracies and they'd hold up forever. And then, hey, look, even if you can be all postmodernists and say there's no reason to assume our government ideas are better than theirs and we are imperializing them, it's like, if I just get over that, ignore that argument, if it works as easy as it sounds, then, you know, it should be viable. And that's how a lot of neoconservatives think of it. It's like, well, we have this philosophy. We know it is moral. We know we have overwhelming power. I don't see why we can't apply our overwhelming power and then implement our worldview. And the issue is just the restrained versus unconstrained vision, right? It just doesn't work in real life. So a lot of intellectualizing things like war lead to a lot of broad statements, dehumanizations, and then it doesn't work. I think that's probably really relevant when you talk about Vietnam. The other thing about Vietnam specifically is there's a big fake narrative about Vietnam, which has been perpetuated by H.R. McMaster. He wrote that whole book. I can't name it offhand. You might know it better than me. But he famously, it's the dereliction of duty. And the whole concept there is that Lyndon B. Johnson tied their hands. And the only reason why we failed in Vietnam is because the generals couldn't do what they want because Lyndon B. Johnson was micromanaging them. That's not true at all. There's just no reason to think that's the case just because he wrote a book pretty much bragging that it wasn't his fault. And it's really just the overall conceit of central planning. So I think that is something worth reckoning with I know you don't like that dichotomy, but I think it's really relevant. I think if anything, Thomas Sowell overcomplicates it. It deserves the 2-sentence summary I gave it, but I think that's just a way of viewing the world that is important.
I mean, I would, I guess, to emphasize really what you're saying, that there were quite a few, or there were quite a few public intellectuals, or quite a few scholars, or political scientists, political analysts, who did come out in support of the Iraq War. I mentioned the great Christopher Hitchens. And people were like flabbergasted, like this former Trotskyist, former socialist revolutionary comes out in favor of the Iraq War. People are like, what the heck is going on with this guy? And he's only one, he was only, he's an easy example to pick out just because he was so well known for his writings and his public speaking. But I mean, it's true of many, many other people, like I said. And it was true, again, during the Vietnam War. I mean, Henry Kissinger, that despicable human being, if I may, if I can utter his name without, God striking me down. I mean, he is kind of an example of someone who is, you could say, a public intellectual, but he's actually a he's a unique case, since he's a public intellectual who really has blood in his hands in a way that many other public intellectuals, never had or don't have right now. But I need to bring up the unconstrained versus, or I need to comment on that because, and again, this is another rabbit hole we don't have to go down, but the only reason I disliked that framing of things was because I realized, when you sent it to me and when I was hearing Sol's argument, I realized we were going to have major communication issues, because I knew even before you said to me, Matthew, you have the unconstrained vision. I knew you were going to say that. I knew that's how you're going to characterize my position. I was just like, no, that's a very bad characterization of my position. I think I can understand where the misunderstanding comes from, but I didn't. If I have to like truly put myself in one of those boxes, I actually do fall more in the constrained vision, but I don't think you see it that way. So I was like, well, I just don't want to open that can of worms. It's not going to be helpful. He is already starting from, he's already analyzed my position in a way that I don't feel is valid. But I mean, again, it can be a fair criticism of certain academics who aren't really in touch with the world, or they aren't in touch with certain practical realities.
Well, and I think the reason why I wanted to talk about that in the past is because I always want to talk about narrow policies, but I know that we always fail to do that. So I tried to be sneaky and bring up saying, let's talk about narrow policies, but I really said, let's talk about this idea of the unconstrained and constrained vision. But in the end, it was going to be me interrogating you on your policies and why I don't think they work. And then I could say, see, it doesn't work in practice, so it's the unconstrained vision. But that's aside the point. I wanted to delve in on what you're saying about public intellectuals too. I just want to make a couple minor points. But if you recall in 2016, it's not public intellectual, but Hillary Clinton she pretty much ran as the most qualified technocrat of all time. And Hillary Clinton is a hawkish Democrat, right? And there is this ethos that if you are a peace, love, hippy dippy Democrat, it's because you don't know anything. And there's this ethos that the very respectable National Review conservatives that are willing to say there are good times for war, just like Hillary Clinton. Those people are the wise people who are smart, and those are the technocrats you should trust, because they're willing to accept the harsh things of reality because they are smart and genuine. And in reality, they're the people who think that we could have won all these wars that have been going on for decades in a few years if we just did it just perfectly right. And in the end, I would say that's no different than the Fed trying to micromanage interest rates, even though they're causing the next boom and bust. And I would say that's pretty much an example of what 9/11 is. It's just the boom and bust cycle, but it's happening in foreign policy. That's why I think those things are just so easy to kind of tie together. And that's why, I was talking to you earlier, and I know it doesn't completely make sense, but in terms of ethos, or in terms of these very, very broad principles of trying to plan things with information you don't have, or you're making like very strict assumptions, I think those models are generally very limited. And I see that happening both domestically and foreign in foreign policy. And that's why I think I didn't have those intuitions when I was younger about war, but now that I've really gone into the econ side, it's when I get into econ, it's almost sociology, and all of that is still front and center when you're talking about foreign policy. But yeah, all the technocrats are always going to be the people who are the neoliberals that are talking about all the soft power and all the hard power and when it's necessary. And to some extent, they might be more good-hearted because they don't necessarily want the war, but they think it is very necessary a lot of the time in ways that I think is overly broad. And I think that's the reason why you wouldn't have been a person who was happy to vote for Hillary Clinton. But I'll let you get a few more thoughts out there, and then I'll wrap up.
So I guess I'll kind of give my closing thoughts then. Well, I wanted to have this conversation. I mean, one, because it's just kind of humorous to me that I'll, the joke we've had for a couple months now. I'll be a neocon in 6 years. That's just humorous to me. Like, what will I believe in 6 years? Will I truly be a despicable neocon? But on the other hand, I think it's an interesting conversation or an important conversation to have because, I mean, neoconservatism just seems to have infected, almost everything, just infected the way that the politics, both domestically and abroad, it works. So, I mean, at one level, it's almost like, well, if you're going to engage with politics at the way in given the way politics is now, if you're going to engage with it, I don't think you can be a pacifist, even if in theory you are a pacifist. Now, in theory, I'm not even a pacifist in theory, which can make me even so. If I'm not a pacifist in theory, and I'm willing to think about foreign policy within the current context, even though I'm critical of the establishment, well, then I could see why someone would say, well, then you're kind of a few steps. You're not far off from the neocons, but I mean, I do think I am in because I do think I'm more I'm less governed by this one ideal, and I'm more trying to deal with as much as possible. I'm acting. I mean, I'm talking like I'm someone in power, which I'm not. But when I'm thinking about these issues, I think try to deal with them. I try to deal with issues as they arise. But it's like, so earlier I was listening to, I told you this, I was listening to a conversation between Michael Malice and an objectivist scholar whose name I forget. He's an Israeli objectivist scholar. You remember his name?
His name's Yaron Brook, and I'm presuming it was on Lex Friedman's podcast.
Yaron Brook. It was on Lex Friedman's podcast. But I bring that up because Michael Malice was quoting Ayn Rand as saying something that I thought was particularly stupid when she said there will be, if we follow her idea of selfishness is virtue, which again is a whole other hour and a half long conversation in and of itself. She said there will be no war, there will be no more war, and Michael Malice was basically he seemed to be agreeing with that. And I say that's one of the most stupid things I've heard because I don't see war going away anytime soon. It's like, yes, before there were large governments, there wasn't war, but there, I mean, because there wasn't a large collection of. It was kind of pre-monopoly on violence, So it's like there was war between tribes, there was war between groups. You could say, but war at a very small scale. Now, and for a good bit of human history, we've been able to do more war at a larger scale because we have more organized communities and we have government and whatnot. But I don't see war just disappearing overnight. I don't even see war going away in 100 years or 200 or 300 years. So which is why I said earlier, I'm not a pacifist. I think we have to think about when war might be necessary, but only when it's necessary. Which again, and then you can ask me, well, when is it necessary? We don't agree on that, and I would say we don't have to agree on that, but it is something that's debatable. But it's something that we have to debate. I just think for reasons of human nature and of human history. I don't like war more than anyone. I don't like war just like pretty much nobody likes war except the neocons and the hawks, but I don't see it going away. And so therefore I'm not willing to say that interventionism, I would say interventionism, I would distinguish that from imperialism as such. I think interventionism is sometimes necessary for that reason.
I do like when you talk about foreign policy because it makes me seem like a particularly uniquely nice person because I'm willing to kind of rule out pretty much anything that's not in self-defense. And I'm also a person who doesn't really think a nation really means anything. So like if some place is attacked, like if Mexico attacks California for some odd reason, I wouldn't really feel attacked. I don't live in California. It doesn't really seem like it's my problem either, because the United States doesn't really represent me in the way I feel about the world and the way I interact with the world. I just happen to live here, and they happen to subject me to their rules. So I don't feel a lot of the impulses, if anything. And I think I would add, well, I'm not going to bother, but I would say that Malice quote, the Michael Malice quote, might be a little I think a lot of your critiques of it is due to your reading of what he means when he says that Ayn Rand quote. And I think he predisposes a lot of things that you wouldn't predispose. And I don't think he's implying that in the real world war would go away anytime soon. So I don't think that's really a counter argument. But that's aside the point, and that's not something to get bogged down into. I do think it would be interesting to take on Ayn Rand's idea of what is selfishness, what that means in her worldview, and then to talk about if she is correct in saying that is virtue. But you have to engage with Ayn Rand on her terms or else you lose all meaning, which is the problem with most dialogue around Ayn Rand. And that's why people really hate Ayn Rand, I think. And that's why that Yaron Brook conversation, if anybody's interested in it, it's Michael Malice and Yaron Brook on the Lex Friedman show. It's super long. It's like 4 hours. It puts us to shame. I think that's the whole length of it. But it's interesting because they kind of, spurg out about Ayn Rand in ways that are kind of funny. And Yaron Brook comes off as a total statist in a way that is unique. But I'm just going to wrap this up because I don't have much more thoughts. I just kind of put a lot of stuff out there. I mean, in general, I think it would take a lot for me to think intervention is necessary. And a lot of it is just because the people who tell us the information about if a war is necessary, I do not think are trustworthy. And I do not think they have my interests at heart almost all the time. So it's hard for me to imagine a scenario that is not borderline apocalyptic that would make me think, okay, yeah, this is the right call. Because what is probably going to happen is there are going to be a lot of soft influence peddling that is related to things that are almost Cold War-esque, and it's going to be all on the grounds of sanctions and slandering China for for stealing innovations and stuff like that. And all that stuff is silly, and all of it is just driving, I guess, division. And there's probably other ulterior motives, so I don't really trust it. But I guess that's aside the point. That just goes to my skepticism of the people in charge and the people who make those decisions. And I think you would agree to some extent. I mean, with what you said about Bush and Cheney earlier. But I know you might not take it to the same degree as I am, so I'm not going to put those words to your mouth. So wrapping up. Nope, I'm wrapping up, buddy. You can find more of Matt's content on his YouTube channel, The Anti-Philosopher. He also, our buddy Keegan, who pops in from time to time, he makes some appearances on Keegan's channel to stop by, say hi, and talk about all sorts of things. And I believe that YouTube channel is Essential Salts. If you look that up, yeah, I'm getting an approval nod. So it's Essential Salts on YouTube. You can find our boy Matt featured there. I haven't been that active doing things. I've just been, I guess, busy with life, and I wanted to put out higher quality content. But when you get more busy in life and you want to do stuff that's more research, and yeah, it doesn't necessarily turn out that well. So I haven't been putting out a lot of content lately. But when I do, it's going to be on the Obey podcast channel, unless it's Arguing with Matt, which of course I do on this channel, which is Beyond Talking Points, which you can find us on podcast and on YouTube. So for now though, after all that, info dump. Sign off for now. It's Mad Matt.